I didn't set out to question centuries of accepted genealogical records. I was researching European royal marriages, mapping the usual suspects, Habsburgs, Romanovs, Tudors, when I noticed something odd. Not a single anomaly, not one document, but a pattern of missing connections that once you see it, you can't unsee it. The official family trees we're shown present an unbroken chain. Father to son, mother to daughter, marriages arranged, alliances forged, bloodlines preserved. But the deeper I looked, the more I found gaps that shouldn't exist. Transitions that happened too cleanly, genealogies that appeared fully formed, as if written backward from a conclusion already decided. And that's where the Tartarian question becomes impossible to ignore. Start with a simple exercise. Pull up any major European royal family tree from the 18th or 19th century. Follow the maternal lines. Now ask yourself, where did these women come from before they married into known dynasties? The official explanation gives us minor nobility. Distant cousins, princesses from German principalities so small they barely warranted a dot on contemporary maps. But here's the strangest part. When you try to trace these women's own ancestry back just 2 or 3 generations, the documentation becomes remarkably sparse. Not incomplete. Sparse. As if their histories began the moment they became useful to the narrative. Consider the marriages that consolidated power across Europe in the 1700s. We're told these unions were strategic, political, calculated to the finest degree. Yet the brides often appeared with minimal lineage documentation, married into the most documented families in human history, and then their origins became unquestioned fact. No one asked, no one verified. The silence was deafening. This raises a simple but critical question. If these royal houses were so obsessed with bloodline purity, why would they accept brides whose ancestry couldn't be traced with certainty? Unless that ancestry was deliberately obscured. Look at the Romanovs. The official history tells us they descended from the Rurik dynasty, a clean line of succession stretching back centuries. But the deeper I went into the genealogical records, the more I found transitions that seemed managed, constructed. The documentation exists, certainly. Marriage certificates, birth records, court announcements. But what about the bloodline itself? There are whispers, academic whispers, the kind mentioned in footnotes and then never expanded upon, of Tatar ancestry in several major Russian noble families, not Mongolian. Tatar, the word itself, is a derivative, a linguistic cousin to a name we're not supposed to say out loud in historical circles, Tartary. Now look westward. The British royal family underwent a similar transformation. The House of Hanover imported from German territories in 1714. We're given the official explanation: Protestant succession, parliamentary approval, legitimate claim through distant Stuart ancestry. All documented, all proper. Except, when you examine the German principalities these royals came from, you find something peculiar. Many of these small territories had themselves undergone recent dynastic changes, new families, new names, new crests, all within a generation or two of being called upon to provide British monarchs. The evidence suggests something much larger than isolated dynastic accidents. But perhaps I'm seeing patterns in randomness. Perhaps these genealogical gaps are simply the normal erosion of time, the inevitable loss of documentation across centuries. Then I started looking at the buildings these families built, not the castles they inherited, the ones they constructed during their consolidation of power. In St. Petersburg, the Winter Palace. In London, Buckingham Palace's major renovations. In Vienna, the Schönbrunn Palace expansions. In Madrid, the royal palace construction following the 1734 fire that conveniently destroyed the previous Habsburg residence. All of them share architectural elements that official history attributes to neoclassical revival or Baroque influence. But here's what troubles me. These buildings don't just share stylistic choices, they share specific technical features. Construction methods, proportion systems, decorative mathematics. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision across thousands of miles. across cultures that supposedly had minimal contact, across royal houses that were allegedly rivals. Who were the architects? Different names in different countries, certainly. But when you try to trace where these architects trained, where they learned to build at such massive scale with such uniformity, the trail goes cold. Not everywhere, just at the critical points, just where the knowledge would have been transmitted. If you're finding value in this investigation, I encourage you to explore these architectural connections yourself. The evidence is hiding in plain sight. Now let's talk about maps. Because maps don't lie the way words can lie. They show what was known, what was believed, what existed in the minds of those who drew them. Pull up maps of Asia from the 1600s and 1700s, French maps, Dutch maps, British maps. Look at the vast interior labelled Tartary or Grand Tartary or Tartaria. Not a small region, not a footnote. An enormous territory stretching from the Caspian Sea to the Pacific Ocean, from Siberia to the frontiers of China. These weren't speculative maps, they were trade maps, military maps, maps drawn by cartographers who staked their reputations on accuracy because merchants and generals depended on their accuracy. And on many of these maps you'll find something fascinating. Symbols indicating cities, trade routes, and yes, royal courts, multiple royal courts throughout Tartarian territory, as if this wasn't a collection of wandering tribes but an organised society with governmental structures. Then, over the course of the late 1700s and early 1800s, the label changes. Tartary becomes Russia in the west, becomes Qing China in the east, becomes Ottoman territory, becomes nameless in between. The deeper I looked, the more I had to ask, where did the people go? Not the land. We can watch the land get redistributed on maps. The people. The royal courts those earlier maps indicated. The governmental structures, where did they go? Here's what bothers me most. When empires fall, we have transition periods, we have documentation of collapse. Rome didn't vanish overnight, we have centuries of its decline meticulously recorded. The Byzantines left volumes of historical testimony about their final days. Even the Mongol Empire's fragmentation is well documented. But Tartary? If it existed, as these maps suggest, we should have transition documentation, treaties of dissolution, succession disputes, refugees, resistance movements, something. Instead, we get silence, and into that silence we get new royal families with suspiciously recent genealogies claiming territories that maps from a generation earlier labelled as Tartarian. The official explanation collapses here. We're told that Tartary was just a catch-all term Europeans used for the vast unknown interior of Asia. A map label, not a real political entity. But that explanation requires us to believe that European cartographers who were sophisticated enough to accurately map coastlines, trade routes, and territorial boundaries elsewhere suddenly became vague and imprecise only when it came to the largest landmass on their maps. That they drew borders, marked cities, indicated royal courts, all for something that didn't actually exist as a cohesive entity. Does that make sense to you? Now we arrive at the most troubling aspect. The bloodline question isn't just historical, it's genetic. We have genetic testing now. We can trace ancestry through DNA, confirming or refuting genealogical claims that once relied solely on documents. So why hasn't there been a comprehensive genetic study of European royal families mapping their actual ancestry? Not the claimed ancestry, the actual genetic heritage. Some studies exist, certainly, small ones, targeted ones, but never a complete mapping of the royal bloodlines using modern genetic techniques. Why not? These families are obsessed with their heritage, with proving their legitimacy, with documenting their divine right to rule, unless there's something they don't want found. Consider what DNA testing has revealed about ancient populations. We now know that groups we thought were isolated and pure were actually mixed, showing genetic markers from continents away. We know that pure bloodlines are a myth, that humanity is a tapestry of mixing and migration. So what would a comprehensive genetic study of European royalty show? What markers might appear that don't match the official genealogies? What Central Asian or Siberian genetic signatures might emerge from families who claim pure Germanic or French or British descent? And that's where the silence becomes deafening again. The same families who commission studies of their artwork, their archives, their palaces, they've shown remarkable disinterest in genetic verification of their bloodlines. Not why, not when, not under which circumstances, but how. How do you suppress curiosity about your own origins in an age of genetic discovery, unless you already know what the results would show? Before you dismiss this as speculation, let me show you something specific. Go to Vienna, stand in front of Schönbrunn Palace. Now go to St. Petersburg, stand in front of the Winter Palace. Now to Beijing, the Forbidden City's outer buildings. What do you notice? Not just similar architectural styles, the exact same proportion systems, the same relationship between height and width, the same ratios in the window placements, the same mathematical principles governing the spatial relationships. This isn't coincidence, this is transmitted knowledge. Specific technical knowledge about large-scale construction, about load distribution, about creating the impression of power through architecture. And here's the critical detail. Many of these buildings were constructed or significantly modified during the same narrow window of time, the early to mid-1700s. The exact period when Tartary was disappearing from maps and new dynasties were consolidating power. The official history tells us these similarities are due to travelling architects, to shared aesthetic trends, to the influence of Palladio or other classical masters. But that explanation requires incredible coordination. It requires architects from different empires, supposedly rivals, to independently adopt not just similar styles, but identical mathematical systems, to build at massive scale in multiple capitals simultaneously. And to do all of this while their patron families were allegedly competing for supremacy. Or, and I'm just asking the question here, were they not rivals? Were these separate royal families actually branches of the same ancestral tree, building in a common architectural language because that language represented their shared heritage? A heritage that needed to be hidden. I need you to look at something else. Royal heraldry. The symbols these families chose to represent themselves start with the double-headed eagle. It appears in the heraldry of the Holy Roman Empire, the Russian Empire, the Byzantine Empire, several Balkan nations, and various German principalities. We're told this symbol was adopted and readopted independently, that it represents different meanings in different contexts. But symbolism this specific doesn't emerge randomly. The double-headed eagle is a complex symbol, requiring specific artistic knowledge to render correctly. And it appears across cultures that supposedly had limited contact during the periods when it was adopted. Now look at other recurring elements, specific crown designs, particular arrangements of lions and bears, the repeated use of certain colours in specific combinations. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. These families weren't just copying each other's homework. They were using a common symbolic vocabulary, a language of power and legitimacy that predated their official founding dates, a language that suggests common ancestry. Here's something that doesn't make sense. When royal families married across borders, language was allegedly a barrier. We have documented accounts of princesses arriving in new kingdoms unable to speak the local language, requiring years to learn. Yet we also have accounts of these same families conducting private correspondence, understanding each other perfectly when it mattered for political negotiations. What language were they using in these private contexts? The official answer is Latin or French, the diplomatic languages of Europe. But there are tantalizing references in old documents to other languages being used in certain royal contexts. Languages described as ancient or traditional, but never specified. What if there was a lingua franca among these families that wasn't French or Latin? A language from their actual common ancestry? A language that would have revealed too much if used publicly? I'm not claiming I know what language that was. I'm asking why there's so much deliberate vagueness around linguistic practices in royal households during precisely the period when their genealogies become most important to establish. Count the fires. Seriously, make a list of major fires that destroyed royal residences, government archives, and genealogical records between 1650 and 1850. The Royal Palace in Madrid, 1734, the Library of Congress, 1814, the Crystal Palace, 1936, the Hanover State Archives, multiple fires, most records lost. And these are just the famous ones. Dig deeper and you'll find dozens of smaller but critical fires that destroyed specific genealogical records, land registries, and historical documents during this transformative period. Some fires are inevitable across centuries. Buildings were made of wood and lit by open flames. Accidents happened, but the deeper I looked, the more I found fires occurring at suspiciously convenient moments, right before genealogical claims would need verification, right after territorial transitions, right when old records would contradict new official narratives. And after each fire, the reconstruction of records favoured the newly established order, the newly documented bloodlines, the newly claimed territories. The pattern repeats with unsettling precision. Let's talk about Siberia, because Siberia is the key to everything. On those old maps, Siberia isn't Russian territory yet. It's labelled as part of Tartary. Vast, resource-rich, sparsely documented Siberia. Then, over a remarkably short period in the 1700s, it becomes Russian. Not through documented conquest, not through treaties we can examine, it just becomes Russian. The official explanation tells us the Cossacks gradually expanded eastward, that the local populations were primitive and offered little resistance, that Russia's claim was inevitable and natural. But here's what troubles me. When Russia did document its expansion into Siberia, the records describe encountering cities, not villages, cities, with stone buildings, with organised populations, with trade networks, cities that don't appear in modern historical narratives, cities that allegedly left no archaeological trace despite being substantial enough for contemporary Russians to document their existence. Where did those cities go? Who built them? And if Siberia had an established urban civilization when Russia arrived, whose civilization was it? The silence was deafening. I've shown you architectural patterns that shouldn't exist, genealogical gaps in the most documented families in history, cartographic evidence of something vast that supposedly never existed, genetic questions that remain deliberately unasked, symbols and languages hinting at common ancestry. What does it all mean? Maybe nothing. Maybe I'm seeing patterns in randomness, connections in coincidence. Maybe the official history is complete and accurate, and these anomalies are simply the normal gaps in any historical record. But what if they're not? What if there was a widespread bloodline connected across vast distances that needed to be obscured? What if the royal families we're told are separate lineages, are actually branches of a single ancestral tree? What if Tartary wasn't a vague geographical term but a civilization whose descendants still rule, but rule under new names, new genealogies, new official histories? What knowledge would that represent? What technologies, what organizational systems, what understanding of governance at continental scale? And why would that knowledge need to be hidden? I don't have answers, only questions that multiply the deeper I look. But I'll leave you with this. The next time you see a European palace, ask yourself who really built it. When you hear about royal bloodlines, ask yourself where those bloodlines actually originated. When you look at a modern map of Asia, ask yourself what was there before the current borders were drawn. And ask yourself why we're not supposed to ask these questions. Why the genealogical records stop at precisely the point where they'd reveal something important. Why the maps change so completely in such a short time. Why the architecture speaks a language the official history refuses to translate. The deeper I went, the more I realised that what we call history might be just the story the victors agreed to tell. And somewhere in the margins, in the deleted chapters, in the fires and the missing records and the too convenient genealogies, there might be another story. A story about who really built the world we inherited. A story we're not supposed to remember. But once you see it, you can't unsee it.